Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today we are talking about invasive plants, and who better to be talking about them with than Emily Grant, Director of Operations at Environet UK, and a relatively regular contributor to Today's Conveyancer. I think it's fair to say, Emily, you pop up from time to time with various bits of PR and advice as well. So thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I do not know anything, or know very little, about invasive plants. Topic of today's discussion is looking at bamboo in particular. That's a newer risk that you guys have been working on and talking about. Pretty familiar with your work on Japanese knotweed, which we'll no doubt touch on as well, and any number of other sort of invasive plant species that homeowners need to be thinking about, and by extension conveyancers as well. But in the first instance, tell us a little bit about yourself and your role, please, Emily.
Thank you. Well, I'm actually an environmental scientist by profession. I've been working in the field of invasive plants for the last 10 years. And as you say, Environet has actually been established for nearly 30 years. We're considered leading experts in the management and removal of invasive plants, like, as you say, the infamous Japanese knotweed, but also things like giant hogweed, Himalayan balsam, and in more recent years, bamboo. And that's certainly a new thing that we've had to overcome, learn about, and now have become experts in as well.
There's a collective groan I can hear from our listeners, because Japanese knotweed has made its way onto the TA6 Property Information Protocol form in recent years. Bamboo could do you think?
I think it would be really challenging to add bamboo on, because there are actually over 1,400 different varieties of bamboo, and 350-ish of those will grow in UK climates, but not all of them are problematic. And that's where the difficulty will lie, to put a blanket question on the TA6 form in the same way that the Japanese knotweed question exists would be extremely problematic in my view.
Okay, well, let's look at what the kind of specific risks associated with bamboo, and which particular species the problem, if you like, and what their impact is on the home.
Yeah, so not all bamboos are problematic. There are many varieties available that are clump-forming and slow-growing and actually pose no problem at all. The challenge really lies with running bamboo varieties, and there are lots of them about, unfortunately, and they send out these long lateral runners in all directions from which the new shoots grow, and this is really where the problem lies. So rather than gradually getting bigger in a predictable way, these runners can grow meters and meters in all directions just in a single year, and they know no limits. So when it comes to property, they easily navigate obstacles, they grow into gaps, cracks, and have no respect for boundaries. So in the wild, it would be fine, because they essentially would turn into what we know as a bamboo forest. But when you put property into the mix, you soon see how invasive bamboos and properties are not good companions.
And this is a similar risk, if you like, to Japanese knotweed, where they infiltrate things like the brickwork. They can get through the floors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So they will exploit cracks, gaps, weaknesses. We quite often see them finding their way into expansion joints or in places where, you just would not want them to go. And in worst case scenarios where they do get into the internals of buildings, we see them running all through voids, coming up through floorboards, coming out of the back of people's ovens. We have seen it all in recent years. And I have to say, these are horror stories. They're worst case scenarios, but I don't think that the risks should be understated, because in my mind, and our research shows, that the perception of bamboo is largely positive. People like it, they continue to buy it, it continues to be available. So unlike Japanese knotweed, where the mere words, send shivers down people's spines, people underestimate the challenges that come with it.
And in terms of the dangers to the property, then, do they destabilize the property in some way, or is it's a visual risk? What's the problem that they present?
They can force apart structures. So as those runners, they can contract and expand to fit through gaps. But yeah, once they're inside a building, the only way to get them out is to physically remove them. So you can imagine, if they've got into a floor void, although they may cause no physical damage, who's going to want bamboo continually poking up through their floorboards? And it's definitely fair to say that they can block services, things like drains. The runners can infiltrate drainage and cause problems. They get into tanks, like septic tanks, things like that. So there are very real risks from a built perspective, but also from a landscaping perspective. So bamboo will have absolutely no problem whatsoever in pushing up through a driveway, for example. It can easily uproot and lift up patio slabs. So although it's perhaps not a huge risk in terms of destabilizing buildings, there's a very real maintenance cost and or potential damage in terms of the other elements that it could destruct.
And whose role is it, I guess, to identify this in a transaction? And I think this is where, and you forgive the pun, this is where some of this starts to fall through the cracks, isn't it? And the same issue with Japanese knotweed, because quite rightly, in many respects, you've got the conveyancer saying, well, perhaps this is a surveyor's job, or perhaps this is a specialist's job. It's certainly not my job, because it's nothing to do with the transfer of title. But equally, those other professions are saying, well, it's not really my job either.
And I think because it's an emerging problem, there are question marks over whose responsibility it should be. I think from my point of view, surveyors should certainly be looking for invasive bamboos. And I'd say there's kind of a list of red flags that I would expect surveyors to be looking for. Things like whether there's already visible damage on a property, whether there's bamboo growing on a boundary, whether there's already evidence of encroachment when they're doing a boundary inspection, for example. These are all things that would be ticking over in my mind as to be flags. Essentially, either defects on that property, which surveyors are obliged to look for and report on, but also liabilities in terms of the legal side as well. So when it comes to boundaries, there are issues around encroachment which need to be flagged, because when you're looking at property value and potential liabilities moving along in the future, the costs associated with bamboo, whether it is encroachment and legal or whether it is repair and maintenance, can run into thousands of pounds. So it's no small sum of money, really. And I think that's where conveyancers need to play their part, is that where things are flagged or identified, or where there is bamboo on a property, particularly on a boundary or in very close proximity to a built structure, they need to be asking the right questions and giving the right advice to their clients to ensure that they're not leaving them with a liability down the line once the property is completed.
We're talking about surveyors, of course. This is if a survey is even instructed. Is it something like only 1 in 4 homes have a survey instructed, isn't it?
Indeed, and that remains a challenge because, as I said before, where the perception of bamboo is largely positive, people aren't even considering it as an issue. And that's where we've been working hard over the last few years, as this problem seems to be increasingly being reported. We are trying to raise public awareness around how bad, we're trying to raise awareness of just how bad bamboo problems can be.
There's an education piece here as well, though, isn't there? So you're on this podcast talking to conveyancers about the risks associated with bamboo and the well-documented risk with Japanese knotweed and other invasive plants. Is there a similar kind of campaign, if you like, in inverted commas, that's going on around some of the other professions, around the surveying community and I mean the lending community as well, potentially?
Absolutely. Yeah, we spend a lot of our time talking to surveyors, and we also try to share in the broader media so that we're raising awareness in the general public that bamboo isn't necessarily a good thing. And we have seen traction on that. We've seen a shift change. We carry out research year on year via YouGov, and we have seen a year on year shift towards people being more aware of bamboo as an issue. So that's really positive, and we're pleased to see that. We certainly don't want it to become the same issue as Japanese knotweed. We don't want people to be running a mile when they hear the word bamboo, but I definitely think that people need to be aware of the challenges so that conveyancers can play their part without having to fight a corner for something that their clients don't even think is a problem, because a mismatch there is going to be a challenge, isn't it?
Well, is there a legal position with bamboo in the same way that, you know, arguably there is with Japanese knotweed with its inclusion on the TA6, for example?
Currently, there's no legislation in relation to bamboo whatsoever. As you say, there's no requirement to declare it, and there are no restrictions in the UK on buying it or selling it. And the only time I think legally would be on a transaction that it would need to be declared if there was an existing dispute with a neighbour, but that would come under disputes rather than anything else. But the biggest threat from bamboo is actually from nuisance claims, and that's really building a lot of traction where there's encroachment from one property to another and the offending party fails to take suitable and sufficient action, and they end up with a claim for nuisance, and that's really starting to come more and more frequently now.
So I guess the challenge here is in identifying where and when it's happening, and presumably you have a report of some description that provides some information about what a homeowner might need to know about, and that's something that a conveyancer could instruct.
Absolutely. So where there is bamboo on a property, you can instruct a specialist report where a consultant will visit the property. They'll identify the bamboo. They'll look at what variety it is, how long it's been planted, and if it's already started to spread, the parameters of that spread. It'll then look at the potential risk factors, so how close it is to a boundary or to a property or a set of services. And then it can provide specialist recommendations on remediation options, so be that a barrier of some kind or excavation or simple monitoring.
Okay, let's touch on the obligations then of conveyancers as you kind of see it, which I know we touched on a little bit, but let's just sort of drill into that a touch. I talked about the collective groan of conveyancers, because we're talking at a point in time where there's a big debate happening about climate change. We're not going to go into that today, but climate change feels as though it's another thing for conveyancers to have to deal with. Here we are now talking today about bamboo. It's another thing that conveyancers have to deal with. Where's the line as far as you're concerned in terms of what the advice to clients should be and how they should advise clients? Again, going back to the climate change comparison, what's increasingly obvious is that the conveyancer advises the client to go talk to the expert. Sort of same sentiment here.
Yeah, I think if there's a genuine concern, then a conversation, even some friendly advice from an expert, is probably a good place to start. I think where there is already an issue flagged, particularly if it's come from a surveyor, then any conveyancer should be recommending that their client seeks a professional report, more so for peace of mind, but also so as they understand the full potential issue that they are going to be inheriting. It's a difficult question as to whether a conveyancer should be proactively asking a question. And I think that so often that's going to depend on the individual situation. I don't think there's any harm in inquiries to ask, particularly if there's ever been any neighbour dispute or any request from a neighbour to rectify a bamboo issue. It seems like a simple enough inquiry should provide some reassurance that there's no problem, or there hasn't been a problem in the past and then it might reoccur in the future. But I don't think that conveyancers should be in the position where they're having to actively ask about invasive plants in the same way. And as I said before, it's a can of worms when it comes to bamboo, because without expert support, it's near impossible for anybody to identify whether something is a problem or could be a problem in the future. Because quite often bamboo can sit quite happily for 5 to 10 years, causing no problems whatsoever. And then suddenly it changes its habit, or it finds its happy place and then starts spreading. So there's not always an easy answer. And I think that having those conversations with specialists is really fundamentally where the path for conveyancers lies.
And we're talking today about bamboo. We've touched on Japanese knotweed. There's a collective here, isn't there, around just invasive plants in general and the challenges that they present to property. Homeowners have really got their work cut out in trying to identify those, though, haven't they?
They have, and I think there's a mismatch, because the plants, for example, that are listed on the Wildlife and Countryside Act, so they're the banned list of plants, the majority of those don't pose a threat to property. They pose a threat to nature, and that's why they're on the list. So when you look at that list of 50 odd species that are on there, you can basically tick 99% of them off as garden plants that you wouldn't think twice about. But there are plants that pose risks to property. Majority of the time it falls down to maintenance. So buddleia is a classic example of that. Everyone loves a buddleia, but if you leave it to grow in the wrong place, it can cause significant damage. So if it's growing out of chimneys, cracks, brickwork, guttering, etc., you very quickly come unstuck with problems with drainage, damp, brickwork actually being pulled apart. So I think rather than people focusing on what plants are the problematic plants, maybe they should be thinking about, how well maintained it's going to be, what are the risks in the future if it's not maintained. Something like a simple ivy growing up a building could be absolutely fine, but unmaintained, it gets into all the places that you don't want it to get into. And then, so any plant really has a propensity to cause damage if it's not handled in the right way. And I think that the same really can be said for Japanese knotweed and bamboo. If they're handled in the right way, if they're maintained in the right way, if they're cared for, they don't have to be a problem. But the challenge is that as a nation, we've become more and more detached from the environment, from nature, from the art of gardening, as it were. And we have much less time than ever before. So it might be a month between your visits into the garden because you're busy, and you won't notice that the bamboo spread 4 or 5 meters across your lawn until it's too late. And I think that's why there are certain plants like bamboo, like Japanese knotweed, that do grow quickly, that people should be more aware of than the other simple plants that might be invasive but ultimately aren't damaging in the context of property.
We're fast moving towards the end of the discussion, and really as a closing kind of wrap up, I wanted to touch on remediation and the cost of remediation as well, and kind of contextualize everything that we've been talking about, because I think we've said there's no real kind of legislative requirement on conveyancers specifically, but sort of the wider property public to report on bamboo, for example. But the cost of getting rid of the stuff is quite staggering, actually, isn't it? If you and particularly if you do it wrong, because there's no imperative to use a professional eradication service, although it's highly recommended.
That's right. I think the challenge with bamboo is that it is tough to remove, and anyone with experience of trying to remove it will soon realise that you bounce off it if you're using hand tools. And we quite often find that people get themselves into a bit of hot water, particularly in the gardener kind of community, where they don't have enough experience of removing it themselves, and they take on these projects and soon realize that it takes significantly longer than they anticipate, that the runners are spread far and wide, that they hadn't realized quite the level of finish that is required by having to remove every single piece of runner. And so often the bills do stack up. And I suppose that's the benefit of using a professional company that specializes in invasive plants, because as an industry we've come from dealing with Japanese knotweed, where we are really quite forensic in our removal process. We trace every single rhizome from the soil, and therefore we come at it already knowing full well what's involved and that meticulous level of detail that is required. But that obviously comes at a cost. It's a specialist removal service. And whilst it still may be quite viable to be able to find a gardener, if it's a small problem, you might be looking at a few £100s to remove a bamboo from a garden. However, the majority of the time, once a transaction is involved or a legal claim, for example, then a professional support is required. More often than not, the problem is already out of hand, and we'll be digging up significant amounts of ground, perhaps removing patios, fences, driveways, you name it. And so you can imagine that the costs quickly mount up. The best and most effective way to remove bamboo is to physically remove it, as opposed to perhaps chemically treating it over time. And therefore, you could be looking at anything from a few £1,000s into the tens of thousands for the very worst cases. And that's why I alluded earlier to the importance of conveyancers not overlooking the risks associated with bamboo, because the costs of removal, as well as then reinstatement, if you're having to remove significant amount of lawn, patio, paving, the list goes on, that all has to be put back at some point. And so it's not just the remediation cost that is high, but also the reinstatement afterwards that adds to the bill.
And the lenders are also looking for guarantees as well that it's been eradicated.
That's right. If it's been flagged by a surveyor, then almost certainly a lender would be looking for some kind of reassurance in the same way that they do for Japanese knotweed. So professionals can offer insurance-backed guarantees for Japanese knotweed, and very recently Environet, delighted to say, were actually the first company in the UK to be able to offer exactly the same policy for bamboo, and we remain the only company in the UK that can currently do that. So I would obviously recommend to all the conveyancing audience that you choose an insurance-backed guarantee provider for your client's removal for ultimate peace of mind.
I said that we were sort of coming towards the end of the discussion and time is up, but it's been an interesting sort of wander through the garden, if you like, in many respects. So thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, Emily, and sharing your insight and expertise as well.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Emily. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.